This is Michael Easley in Context.
Well, welcome to inContext. It's a delight to have you all on the, this is a new venture for us today. We're trying to do some video, introducing a little bit more, hopefully encouraging way to watch things. Let me introduce my guest today. We have Dr. Wendy Widder. Dr. Widder has been on the program before talking about Daniel, and as I told her when we interviewed, I wish I'd have talked to you before I taught the book of Daniel. Dr. Mark Chavalas. Am I saying that right, Mark? Forgive me again.
Chavalas.
Dr. Chavalas has also been on the podcast before, and you can go look at those interviews to find out their Vita and CV. And Dr. Kevin Zuber. Dr. Zuber and I spent a little time at Moody together and had a great friendship there, and growing even now. So thank you all for joining this. We have been doing this big book series that I tackled a little over a year ago, where each Sunday I try to teach one book of the Bible in an overview fashion. Not your typical day, date, author, some of that, but more backing up a little bit and asking the question for people that don't know these books, that perhaps aren't going to study them like obviously you all do, but what can we give them? And you all were great contributors to that, so we appreciate you coming back to help us wrap up the series. About to finish the whole package, and I asked Hannah, who's our executive producer, let's get some of our favorite experts who did such a great job to talk about this big picture concept. And I don't have a script. I don't have. I've got a few questions in my head, and if you've got something, Michael, we really need to talk about X. I want you to jump in, but let me just. I'll start at the end of the alphabet because Dr. Zuber always had to wait to be called on in class when you were a child. So, Dr. Zuber, Kevin, when you think about, and you're teaching in a seminary, all of you are in some fashion. When you're looking at your students, you're in the weeds. You're scholars, you're subject matter experts. But when you step back a bit and look at those local ministries, church ministries, missionaries, whatever they're going to be doing in life, how do you help motivate, encourage them to get in this big book and stay in it all their lives? Kevin?
Well, one of the biggest problems that we have with a sort of big book view of the Bible is really two things. One is it's a book that's got a lot of history in it. And that history is just something that most Christians don't know. They don't know it. They don't know it broadly. I mean, BC means before I cared. That's
now.
Too far back. I mean, those are the kind of things. And so trying to sort of put things into a historical flow is very difficult. So if you're trying to do what you did, Michael, I did that a couple of times in different pastorates, is just do a book of the Bible each Sunday morning in a Sunday school class, on a big blackboard before we had PowerPoints and everything like that. Just give it overview. And one of the things I would do differently is that I would try to do things a little more chronologically. So putting things in sort of a chronological order and put dates to it rather than just the order of the books in the Bible. So that's part of it too. So if you're going to do a grammatical, historical hermeneutic, getting the history right, I think, is just helpful to understand the flow. And the second thing is, and I think I'm a systematic theologian, but we've made great strides in bringing together biblical theology and systematic theology as rather than enemies, as co-laborers, I guess, in the endeavor to do just what you're talking about there, and sort of get the biblical theological flow. The salvation history, I guess, as well as other, the broader history. And, in some respects, that sounds dry when you're talking about trying to get the people.
Well, I was going to inject there. When you say the word history, we've lost, in the average church, we've lost a lot of our population unless we had really great history teachers. Yeah, I contend that, if you got a great history teacher, then you love it's the current event of the time. But if you have a boring, droning history teacher in high school or college, you got no interest in learning biblical history.
Right. That's the challenge, isn't it? I mean, that's the point, is to trying to bring that to life. I've discovered that when you do that, and you don't have to give detailed history, trying to figure out who Tiglath-Pileser is, or pronounce Nebuchadnezzar's name correctly. That's if you bring some of that out, I mean, I'm sure Wendy would say that too with Daniel. Understanding the history, the historical context that Daniel was in is really important to really get the flow of things, and it's the challenge to make it interesting and bring that biblical theological flow out, and just then plug everything in. I've discovered that people, as a pastor, when people started to get a little bit of that, they would say things like, "Wow, it's making sense to me. I understand now where things land. Where you're reading in First and Second Kings, and okay, Hezekiah shows up, and then you say, well, this is where Isaiah was, and their eyes light up.
Right.
Okay, so it's just not something delivered on tablets.
Dr. Widder, Wendy, jump in here. So you spent 10 plus years in Daniel, and right?
I did.
And when you go to a group and you're teaching or explaining or walking them through it, I mean, you've got the same challenge. So how do you help them not over? I mean, I had professors who used to say, Michael, don't use Greek and Hebrew in your messages too much because you take the Bible out of people's hands. And they feel like, well, I can never read it like Dr. Widder because how do you help them?
Well, I think one of the things that's most helpful for me before I ever teach Daniel is to try to give them the picture of how the chronology of the whole Bible works. Daniel fits in the historical context, but if you just tell them that and rehearse all the history behind it, they're snoring. But there are several resources, and I've adapted some things where I draw a big timeline on the whiteboard, and we just go through the story because it's a magnificent story from Genesis to Revelation. And once they have a sense of the history told in like 1 hour, you just got to pack it all in, then you can slot where Daniel fits. And then, like Kevin was saying, they go, oh, I get it. That makes a little better sense. I understand where the people came from, where they're going, and what on earth Daniel's doing where he is. So for me, that's been the most helpful way to give people context. The Bible's a big book, and it's a lot of words.
Yeah.
And there aren't very many pictures. They're pictures, but we have to paint them. And for me, and I found for some students, it's really helpful to just have a timeline and talk through the events and put the books on the timeline and arrange them in such a way that they go, oh, I get it.
I remember
so it's visual.
The first time, I forget where I was, but the first time someone pointed out to me that Adam and Noah were contemporaries. Blew my mind. Because for lots of reasons, but again, the timeline. So Kevin, you use a blackboard and a timeline. Wendy uses a whiteboard and a timeline. We're progressing technologically here. Mark, how about you? How do you get your students to be interested in the text, not bored by it?
Well, I use clay tablets, but that's what the joke is, of course. And by the way, that crack about Tiglath-Pileser, of course, being a Mesopotamian scholar, I would tongue-in-cheek take issue with it because, of course, my first question is, which one do you mean? There's a couple of them. But anyway,
right, yeah.
I think I think I probably approach this a little differently, and it's not that I'm right or wrong. It's just because of my own background, being raised as a Christian, but not knowing any better. And so I went to school, and I loved history and I loved the Bible. I didn't know how to combine them. And so, and not knowing any better, I didn't go to Bible school. I went to secular schools. And so all of my training is secular. And somehow I was able to come out of that still with an evangelical faith. And from that, it means that, of course, when I've been teaching in a secular context, which I've been doing for nearly 40 years now. And so it's interesting when you mention how do you get people interested in the Bible. For me, of course, I have Christians in my class, but overwhelmingly, I have students who either have no interest in the Bible, no knowledge of the Bible, or are antagonistic towards it whatsoever. And so my goal is to put the Bible in the context of other ancient books that we're looking at, showing them, oh, this book is no different than these other books. It actually provides just as interesting history. It's just as formidable as looking at a classical writer like Plutarch or looking at cuneiform documents or the like. And so they begin to realize, oh, the Bible does have some merit. And then I begin to try to show them my passion. Like, this is really fun. I kind of like to try to figure out how to pronounce Nebuchadnezzar's name in Akkadian rather than how the Hebrews must have botched it in their script, or even Tiglath-Pileser or things like that. And so I'll have students afterwards, especially if we're dealing with a particularly difficult text in the Bible. I remember one guy raised his hand in the middle of the class and said, "Excuse me, sir, is this the Holy Bible?" And what he meant was, I didn't hear about this story in Sunday school. I didn't. It never occurred to me that they had such difficulties.
Wow.
And I tell them, oh, the Bible has everything in there. It's very raw. It's got some very, very difficult things. In fact, it's got lots of stuff in there that I cannot easily resolve. And so I remember, even when I came to the faculty at University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, most of whom were atheists in my department, they were always asking me biblical questions. And quite often they would be asking questions that with our current state of knowledge could not be reconciled or resolved. And so I would be telling them, hey, that's a really good one. I'm going to study it for you and come back. And they appreciated it.
Yeah.
Rather than simply giving them, this answer or that. Well, I do the same thing with students, where we'll talk about these issues. And so the best thing that happens to me at the end of the semester, if somebody comes up and says, hey, I was raised as a Catholic, or I was raised as a Lutheran, but the Bible didn't really, we sort of looked at it, but I have this whole new view of it now. And so I look at myself perhaps differently than somebody that teaches at a Bible college or a seminary. Maybe it's pre-evangelism, where I'm getting them intellectually prepared for the next step.
Right.
That next step could happen in my office, hopefully, if we're back in the office soon. But things like that could happen in my office, or it could be somebody else that works through them.
Let me.
Now I have to also run.
Let me interrupt. Let me ask a question, because again, you all have been doing this a long time. This type of technology, these tablets and phones, are your students primarily using tablets or phones, or are they using notebooks? What are they doing when they're in class?
Well, I'll go ahead.
I can't answer that very well because
Sure.
I'm online most
Sure.
of the time. So my students are online.
Kevin?
Well, in my class, because of COVID and stuff,
Let me ask, pre-COVID, were you seeing a growth in phone use versus pen and paper or even notebook?
It was about 50-50, honestly.
Okay.
I mean,
from your pedagogies, where you've lived and breathed, has there been a diminished retention or interest in doing something on a phone versus a book?
Yeah, again, I would say about 50-50. I mean, there's some people that are addicted. They got the virus, and they're addicted to their screens, and you just have to sort of work with that. I mean, again, it's just because I'm ancient, but because I do try to sort of teach students, not material, in class, is that I do things that make it so that they got to get their eyes up off their phones or anything. So I do stuff on the board. I do some PowerPoints. I do some moving around in class. I try to make the living moment in the classroom more important than what's going on, on their screen.
And I appreciate that. But again, I'm not asking the question accurately. From the consuming student, he or she, are they using those devices more? And do you see a better retention, a better knowledge base, or less?
Again, I would say that the computers actually do. I mean, you can take more notes faster,
okay.
So they do get more, and they keep it more than if they wrote it out by hand. I think, but it's still IQ applied to a problem. I mean, and the point is that the more they're engaged, they get it. The better students would do well if they didn't have computers, and the poor students wouldn't do any better if you gave them more technology.
Mark, what do you think?
Well, I'm also very old-fashioned. I'm sure it's not because of my age, but I think I tell my students often at the very beginning of the semester, because I still encourage them to take handwritten notes. And I tell them, I said, when you're taking handwritten notes, your retention is much higher than if you're simply looking at a screen. And I give them an example. I remember one time, this is, years ago when I was in graduate school, I missed a class one day and had to talk to a student. Hey, I'd like to, look at your notes. Well, of course, this is before, Xeroxing or anything. And so I had to go home and rewrite the notes out.
Wow.
And I found out, oh my goodness, I retained twice as much as if I had been there myself. And of course, that's very idealistic, but I try to tell the students, if you do it the old-fashioned way, you are going to retain a lot more. Of course, we can use these. I'm just beginning to figure out how to now use the computer screen on a big screen and show them maps and show them documents as I'm working through it, etc. But I encourage them not to be passive by simply looking at it, but actively writing things down. Oh, this is my perception of what I'm looking at, or that. And it doesn't always work, but that's going to be my ultimate goal.
Wendy, how about you? You said mostly online, but
Well, yeah, I sort of have a hodgepodge of what I do, so it's hard to answer that question directly. But I would echo Mark that handwriting, I think the studies would back it up too, that when you write something, you learn it better and your brain thinks differently.
Yeah.
And just logistically, it takes longer.
Yeah.
So it slows you down.
Yeah.
And one of the things sort of related, when I started taking Greek and Hebrew and having to translate passages that were really familiar to me, but when you have to translate them, it slows you down to this crazy slow speed. You're slogging through BDB. I'm like, But man, you just see it in a different way because you are crawling through it. So the pace, there's something to be said for the old-fashioned, methodical way of just writing.
I just came out of a seminar recently that for charter schools, they were talking about grammar, diagramming, and cursive being the three most important ways they taught. And it blew my mind. And the studies on neuroplasticity and neuroscience with the pressure of a pen, if you remember, if it was an NILD years ago came up with this rhythmic writing for kids that were dyslexic or attention deficit or audio processing deficiencies. And they do a writing program, and they go from, let's say, 6 months behind their age grade to 6 months ahead in about 3 to 4 months doing these neurosynaptically designed repetitive handwriting. But we're off in the weeds. But I was just curious from your teaching perspective what you're seeing in retention and how students engage, because they talk about thumb typing, which you lose all the benefit of the things we've been talking about. Let's go back a little bit to the big picture of the scripture. How would you, if you were the dean with curriculum in your existing area, what would you say these are the 1, 2 things we must do to get folks back in the text, a love for the scripture, a love for reading? You've all mentioned timelines and chronologies and big pictures. What else would you say?
Well, one of the things that we, try to do here is, in a seminary, we get students that have gone to Bible college or have grown up in a Christian church, Bible teaching church, which it may or may not, help in some respects. But in any case, or we get guys that have gone to a secular school. When I started seminary, I'd gone through college and I had a BA in Bible, and I'd already taken 2 years of Greek, and I started seminary with a guy that got a degree in animal husbandry from Ann Arbor, from the University of Michigan. So it was tough for him. So we recognize we get students at all different levels. And so one of the things, again, that we have taken another look at our survey classes. And again, sometimes survey classes can be really helpful, or sometimes they can just be, doing something so that we feel like, well, we gave them a chance because there was the survey class, but it was like trying to take a sip out of a fire hose. That it becomes way too fast. So I think one of the things we try to encourage is just what you're talking about. In our survey classes, there's a textbook, but we try to let's read the scriptures. Let's read the scriptures. Back in the Moody days, Michael, when we were back there, the survey classes required students to actually read the Old Testament all the way through, and in the New Testament survey to read the New Testament through twice. And I think in some respects, especially at an academic level, you sort of lose the value of reading through. So I did again this year what I've done in past years is I read the whole Bible in 4 months, in addition to everything else.
Would that take you about an hour a day?
Sometimes, I didn't do it every day, but I kept a little notebook and things, plus the fact that I would read certain parts multiple times. Right. In 4 months, I read through Psalms 25 through 34 50 times. Wow. Just those Psalms over and over again. But it was that quick readings, that fast reading going through. And I did it honestly because I got to 1st and 2nd Chronicles and I looked at every single name. I mentally went through it. I know I'm not retaining anything, and this is just a pedantic exercise, but I read every word. And then other places, you read it, you catch yourself getting caught up in the story, and you just keep reading. I know what's coming next, but I want to see it again. I want to read it again. Yeah. So we emphasize that. There's Bible reading, and there's really just no replacement for it. It's hard as a scholar. I'm sure the others would say the same thing. Is you come across something and you want to. First, you look at the footnote. Oh,
it's a rabbit hole. Yeah, you go.
Look at the encyclopedia, and then you want to keep chasing something else down. And it's a discipline at this point to just, no, I'm going to just keep reading. I'll come back to that question later, but just read it.
That and folks need to hear that because I use the Logos software. I'm an early adopter. I live in it. But when it comes to devotions and reading, I have to just use my text. Otherwise, I'm in a word study and, Wendy mentioned BDB. I just, boom, I'm gone. So I have to just use that. And I have colored pens. A friend of mine says, Michael, I don't know if you've read the Bible, but you've colored most of it, because I draw in it, right? Because I have my line morning by morning, new verses I read. But again, I'll pose the same question quickly to Mark and Wendy. Beyond the timeline, beyond getting them, how do you motivate, encourage, and to people in general to get their nose in the book? Mark? Okay, Wendy, go ahead. Wendy, go ahead. No, go ahead, Wendy.
Who recommended exactly what Kevin was just talking about. And I don't know if it was required or not, but I did it. And he said, read it just as fast as you can. Wow. Just skim, read. And I thought, well, what's kind of the point of that? But the point of it is I finally backed away from all of the individual stories. And because I got from Genesis, to the prophets and all that faster, I remembered some of the things that were in Genesis, and it all somehow fit together. I recently gave that challenge to a class, and a couple of them did it, a couple of them didn't. But the ones who did are like, man, I just see it differently.
Mark, so that's great.
Helpful.
Mark?
Well, obviously, because of my background, I have a little different perspective. I think that what they're saying is exactly what I like to do for myself personally. But for example, I do teach a course on ancient Israel, just like I teach a course on ancient Iran or ancient Mesopotamia at my school. And so I tell them, I said, I'm not going to be giving you an overview of the history of Israel. In fact, I do the opposite of what you were talking about. I do it inside out, in the sense that we start looking at particular texts to try to figure out what the large part is. And at the end of the semester, I tell them, all right, this is a course that should be called Materials for the Study of Ancient Israel. And when we're all done, I tell them tongue in cheek, now you're ready to study ancient Israel, because we've looked at the particular documents, trying to figure out this or that, and then they should be able to themselves come up with their overview. I sort of learned this, by the way, Kevin. I think that you'll appreciate this. When I was a young man, my mother decided that she couldn't understand the new pastor at our Presbyterian church in Southern California. So she had heard about this hotshot pastor who basically did the Bible line by line, and it would take a long time. And so this was 1969. So I sat listening to John MacArthur for about 20 years. And then, by the way, I'm one of the only people I know that actually taught occasionally at the seminary out there when it first came out, but I've never been to seminary at all. And so I thought that was rather ironic. But he actually had a big impact on me in a general way, and just looking at the text, working through line by line, which I do with all the documents I look at, whether secular, biblical or not, and then trying to come up with that overview. And I also tell them, sort of tongue in cheek, that I don't think the Bible actually is a history book, but I do think it is the writer's theological reflection on a history that is probably already well known to the reader. And so I do things like that. And then lastly, I tell classes, especially when they aren't particularly interested, I said, if you become a Christian, you're adopted into a new family. And let's just say I adopted, someone into my family, and they said, well, I'm really glad that you're my dad, but I really have no interest in what the Chavalas name means, or where you came from, and when, or the fact that your family came across on a boat in 1908, and et cetera. I'm just not interested in that. And I said, well, that would be sort of odd. So, of course, if you become a Christian, don't you want to know about your family? This is your family. And then try to personalize it for them. Because I think it's too easy to get caught up in the minutia. I think I know myself personally, this is also a hobby. And so sometimes it becomes my hobby and I forget about the person behind the hobby, God. And that's a constant struggle that I have.
Interesting, Mark, that MacArthur took 40 years to get through the New Testament line by line. I remember the story back at Moody that Jerry Jenkins said when they first started up the process of publishing all of his the commentaries, now over 30 volumes. He said to Phil Johnson, this could probably take 10 years. It took 40 years. When MacArthur finished with the New Testament, after he made it through, the Gospel of Mark was the last gospel he went through. It was the last book. One of the ladies in the church came up and said, "Are you going to preach through the Old Testament now?" And MacArthur says, "Neither you or I would be alive long enough to see that happen."
Yeah, exactly.
But, I think, again, I liked your comment, Mark, when you said that that the Bible's not a book of history, which is very true. I mean, the Gospels are not a biography, and it's especially. I wrote the commentary in the Moody Bible commentary. I wrote First and Second Chronicles, and that's very much a theologically driven history. It's all about the Davidic dynasty, and the point there is, it just goes back to reinforce what we said. I mean, because it's not trying to tell us history, but because it assumes, as you said, that the reader's going to know that history. That's the part that, again, you got to go back and sort of let people know. They know a lot. There was a lot of intuitive or implicit knowledge that the authors expected the readers to have that obviously we don't. I mean, this is why it's, we have to go back and reconstruct that. Difficult in the days of, deconstruction and reader response theory. That's
well, and this is my contention with the local church, because we're handicapped at two levels. Actually three. We don't like history. We don't know American history, which is 244 years. How do we expect people to want to know, several thousand years of history? And the task of the exegete and the expositor today and the teacher is so different. Howard Hendricks, who taught for over 60 years at Dallas, made the comment, every incoming class had less biblical literacy. And you do that over the decades, and you see what we have today. They don't know who Tiglath-Pileser is, or they don't even know who David is. I often refer to the 2 Samuel 7. If you don't understand the Davidic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant and the new covenant, you're at a loss before you even open this book. Because these, if we said the Gettysburg Address, if we said the Continental Congress, if we said, whatever, 3 branches, how many people do you know could name the 3 branches of government without having to look on their phone? So
they know that I'm not a bill. I'm just a bill. I'm only a bill, and that's the extent of their civics. I don't know anything beyond that.
So again, let me toss this to Wendy. So you teach in a different sphere because you're really focused in Daniel. I hear you're coming out with a new commentary on.
Yeah. I'm kind of a one-trick pony sometimes. It's a story of just how my life has gone, but so it is. In the ZCOT series with Zondervan, which is Zondervan exegetical commentary on the Old Testament. That's what it is. So hopefully this year still. And then I think I'm done on Daniel because I really can't do any more without plagiarizing myself. So I just got to stop.
As I said before, But my question to you is, when you're writing at that intricacy and that level of depth, do you at times step back and go, how in the world do we, get the average person? I hate to say that, but I'm talking about the person that's not in your world, not in mine. How do we help them? This is the Word of God. This is not just a document of history or just theology. This is a document of God's revelation to man, that he might long to live for him, to love him, to glorify him, to own his sin, to change, to repent. I mean, these are big things, and we don't even understand the history other than what I read on my Instagram feed today.
Well, I think part of it is to capture the significance. So leave the minutia aside because they're not going to look at that first anyway. And what is the gospel? There's good news, and it's good because there's bad news. And if you can capture where people hurt, where they itch, where they feel something, because it's there. The text is applicable across all of those kinds of issues. So if you can scratch that, then you can begin to go deeper. I recently heard a podcast with Carmen Imes, who's an Old Testament professor and scholar, and she tells a story of an Old Testament professor who one of his students complained to him that, this is boring. The Bible's boring. And the professor responded, the Bible's not boring.
You're boring.
You're boring. But the point was, this story is magnificent and it is relevant and you are in it. And if we can't help people see that, and that's more than this podcast can do in 15 more minutes. How do we help people see that? But if we can capture that for people, then all of the minutia of our lives, forget the minutia of history, of our lives, the trivial things that so occupy us, they get eclipsed by the story. And then you're caught. And we've all been caught by that story and how it intersects with our lives and what matters. And as teachers, it's our job to find those connections and grab our students where they feel it. So I can say all that. I can actually tell you how to do it.
And what I'm hearing and watching the three of you, you love what you're doing. You're excited about it. One of you can correct me. Who was it? Was it Tom Hume had gone? Hume had gone to see. Oh, who was this? It wasn't a Scottish preacher. See, my brain's getting holes as I get older. But when someone leaned over to him and says, "You don't believe what this guy's saying," and the journalist who was a professed atheist said, "No, but he does." Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things for me, Howard Hendricks, and for you, perhaps MacArthur and Chuck Swindoll and others. They were so excited about their subject matter. This was the Word of God come alive, and I go, well, they're going to be excited about it. Maybe I should be excited about it. And so I hear that in your, maybe you're not intentionally saying it, but you are saying it because you have a passion about what you're teaching. And that's why your students love you and like you, and they want to hear from you, right? So how do we transfer that? Hopefully you've got a couple of students in each of your classes that, you're looking for that young man or woman that light goes on, right? And then you pour into their life and say, you could really be, used by God, maybe in some language you say to them. Maybe God has a use for you beyond just X. I don't know. I'm prattling a bit, but I keep going back to this. I feel as a pastor now, for most of 40 years, short term at Moody, however, I feel people don't read. They don't have interest. They don't care about history. They're very I, me, my oriented. They're very instantaneous oriented. And I look at most churches in America, and I mean most, they have lost their way. And they're teaching about current events, about social issues. They're not in the Word. And you all know, you can teach about the issues of social justice from the text. You can teach about all races mattering from the Bible. But rather than do that, they come up with how-tos or, packaged materials to keep their congregation interested, I guess. Thoughts?
One of the ways that, again, as a preacher, as well as a pastor for many years, as well as a professor, there's a lot of work, and I'm sure the others would recognize this. There's a lot of work in putting into the understanding of the text that then doesn't make its way in either to the lecture or into the pulpit. I mean, it's something that it's something that's deeper, so that at the end, like for instance, my understanding of expository preaching is that when I'm done, I do not want to have somebody come up to me and say, "Wow, I don't think I ever would have seen that." I want them to say, "Wow, that's really interesting. What the Bible is saying there." If I'm so mystified them, so that they, "Wow, I don't think I've ever seen that." I mean, it's like I liken it to going to the theater. If you go to the theater and you see an actor and you walk out and say, "That guy was a great actor," no, he really wasn't. If you walk out of the theater saying that Hamlet was messed up, I mean, that guy's that's a successful actor. He made you forget that you're watching an actor. And I want my students to see the text. I want them to see that. My enthusiasm for it, maybe some of my own illustrations maybe put me too much into that. But at the end, because I do believe it's the living and active Word of God, my objective is to so present it so as that it does that on its own. I'm sure Mark is in the context where he can't get up there and preach to the students, but he wants to have the text itself, which is more than just the text, to sort of present itself in that living and active sort of way. It takes a lot of work on the part of the person doing, the exegete or the preacher or the teacher. It takes a lot of work to do that, because you have to master and be mastered by the text, and then let it speak, and let the story, as Wendy was saying, let the story sort of capture the person instead of anything artificial, which I think, again, back to your point, Mike and Michael, is that I think in a lot of churches, that work is more than, frankly, a lot of people are willing to invest.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between, learning how to really prepare, another illustration, a good meal, or you can get HelloFresh delivered and think that you're cooking at home. Okay, something like that. Again, well, at least it's not fast food. Well, sort of. Who's fooling who here? I mean, that's the kind of the idea.
Mark?
Well, the particular challenges over the years with students, like I said, that the students I operate with are like those in the church, that they are becoming more and more biblically illiterate. And the first response might be sorrowful, but then I can take it as a direct challenge, because one of the advantages, if I can say that in an odd way, is that It means that when I'm teaching students, I have a blank slate there. They know so little about it. And I often do this even with young Christians. I often will not send them to, let's say, the book of John or Mark. I'll send them to Genesis, because John or Mark, really, if you think about it, don't make a lot of sense unless you understand the Old Testament context to it. Of course, they can make some sense, but if you want the deeper understanding, you have to go back and start with the beginning. Or if I have people ask me, boy, they had polygamy in how do you reconcile the fact that the patriarchs were polygamous? I said, did you read the preface? What do you mean? Genesis 1 and 2 is the ideal. If you don't read the preface, that'd be like starting in chapter 3 of a book and then getting frustrated because you don't understand what's going on. Read the beginning. And so I do that. And I also try to show them, like I said before, my own enthusiasm for the material. And I usually tell my students, I'm going to challenge you at the end that you're not going to come up to me and you're going to say something like, well, I never really liked history. And of course, I mean also the Bible. But now, though I'm not going to be a historian, at least I can watch the History Channel, or at least I can now look at my Bible differently. Because in many respects, those who have been churched before, especially in traditional, denominations, etc., and in some respects, they're sort of immune to looking at the Bible in a fresh way. And so that's also a very particular challenge to deal with. And so I have to be very prayerful and try to figure out, all right, what type of audience do I have? What type of questions are they asking? And then my own approach has to be at least tweaked a little bit, maybe not overhauled, but tweaked to try to respond to the needs of a particular group. And that's not always easy. And and if I'm too caught up in what I'm doing and wanting to be the actor rather than the person who's simply being the facilitator, which to me is always a constant battle. If that's the case, then I'm not even going to notice it, and then that doesn't have good results.
Yeah. Wendy?
Yes.
Well, we have kind of a stream of consciousness going here, and I guess the thing that started it was, again, back, how do you encourage, motivate your audience, your students, the relational network to get in the book? I mean, that's the big question I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say that I haven't already
You plagiarized yourself.
So.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, right. No, I'm agreeing with what my colleagues here have said. It's a tough job, and each audience is different, like Mark was saying, and you do have to. It's not a one size fits all.
What?
I mean, if you're speaking on Sunday morning to a churched group, that's different than
Absolutely.
a classroom of students who never opened the Bible versus seminary students. So there's a lot of individualization.
Yeah, I've often said as a pastor, I wish I could have, given pop quizzes and exams. It might have really helped.
What?
If you can't get real genuine interest, at least you can get compliance.
You will learn. I remember Larry Crabb telling a story many years ago about counseling a student when he was at Denver, and I think they worked together for a couple of years. And one day he was walking across campus, beautiful sunny day in Colorado, and there were some guys like lemmings, on a little knoll on a picnic blanket having a coffee or whatever. And anyway, he stopped and talked to the guys and said, "How are y'all doing?" And this one student started getting into the counselee role. "Well, Dr. Crabb," and he stopped and said, "Oh, you mean like, how am I doing?" He goes, "Yeah, how you doing?" "Oh, I'm enjoying the day." And Crabb sat on the blanket and talked to these guys for about 45 minutes. Fast forward, Larry was doing some conference, and a line, what's going to happen here. And a line of students or conferees are standing in line to talk to him when it's all done. And Larry tells a story about feeling rather accomplished and smug and arrogant. And this kid's coming up to him, and they talk for a few minutes. He goes, "When you look back on our time together, what was like a turning point, an insight for you, where you really started growing And he goes, remember that day you stopped on the grounds and just talked to me like a person? And it illustrates to me you have a dynamic. All of you do. You're gifted individuals, and you teach, and you're infectious. That's why I'm talking to you. You're infectious in my life. And I'm thinking, but it's that cup of coffee with that individual. It's that one-on-one relationship with Jesus, with the 7 key people in the gospel. It's that the gospel now is a person talking to you. I care about you. This is the living word of God. This is truth. This is where I found forgiveness. This is where I find hope. And it almost seems we can't extricate that from any of this discussion, that true teaching is probably going to take place. I remember studying the whole parent language, the word form for teaching, didaske in the New Testament. All Ringsdorf, incredible, like 27 pages in Kittel. And I remember he made this one comment. He said, you cannot separate the life and works of Jesus Christ apart from the word teaching.
Right.
But he wasn't standing in front of students. He wasn't standing in front of a synagogue very often that we know of. He was with men and women, walking across Galilee, walking across the desert, walking across Judea. And it seems to me that may be one of the linchpins we've not talked about.
Well, in the book of Acts, when the opposition was interrogating the disciples or trying to figure out, it says there that they had been with Jesus. And that's that's part of it, which is again, our whole COVID sort of arrangement. I'm amused by these debates about is online learning. Yeah, online learning is fine if you just want to sort of get a rote understanding of things and be able to do well on an exam or something like that. But this is particularly in the context I'm at in seminary, is that we're very much life on life. We're trying to teach these men to be pastors. And we can give them a great understanding of Greek and Hebrew and how to exegete a passage and all of those kinds of things. But, part of what we try to do is sort of say, how do you relate? And again, it's in a context that where it's all about the text, all about the Bible. So it's not something that is ever unrelated to it, because it's always there, sort of in the background. I mean, why does anybody want to come to my office? They want to come to my office for counseling, but they know what they're going to get because that's what they get. But that's what they got when I was a pastor. I told people, I said, if you don't like my preaching, you're going to hate my counseling, because you're just going to get people say, well, I feel like you're preaching right at me. Well, if you come to my office and you're the only one, what do you?
It'll be worse. Yeah, it'll be worse.
But it's that. And I think Wendy was kind of alluding to that. I mean, the point is this life on. It's that, it's something that's caught as well as being taught. It's our involvement with the text. It's what these scriptures have done for me, and how my life is impacted by that. And these stories have been of personal interest to me until you feel like, you were there with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, one of my pet peeves. I don't usually get Babylonian names.
The text does. The text uses their Babylonian names.
I do.
I do. Chapter 3, it uses their Babylonian names like 20 times.
I know. When you get to heaven, I think they want to be identified by the Hebrew name. That's my opinion. But nevertheless, the point is that there's these were living, breathing people who had an encounter with a living and active God. And in the New Testament, who had an encounter, the apostles had an encounter with the incarnate Christ. I mean, that's where, again, that's in the text. It's what the text says. But I mean, you're supposed to try and see that as more than just that story. So it has to be lived by us in front of these people, and we have to be the embodiment of that, I think.
Kevin, what strikes me just from what you've been saying, I this past week, for whatever reasons, was reading the resurrection account in the Gospel of John, and it just struck me, this progression of people going to the tomb and what they did and what their reactions were. And at the end of it, Mary Magdalene runs back to the disciples, because Jesus has given her a message to deliver to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the text says the first thing she said to them was, "I've seen the Lord."
Mm-hmm.
And then she gave him his message.
Yeah.
And the first thing that she shared was herself and her experience and what had changed her life.
Right.
And then here's the message she gave me to tell you.
Yeah.
And it just hit me that connects with people.
Yeah, that's-
Life connects with people.
I think it was Spurgeon that said, "No one ever outgrows the scriptures. It widens and deepens with our years." And that's sort of my morning by morning new verses I read. I never saw that before. I know I've read it a lot of times, but it teaches us still. Dr. Zuber, Dr. Chevalier, Drs. Widder, gosh, thank you so much. I hope you'll do this again. And truly, thanks for what you guys do.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Blessings.
Yes.